In Egypt's western desert, far from the river and its crowded temples, there were quieter places where life gathered around wells, gardens, mud brick walls, and long roads through the sand. At Amheida, in the Dakhla Oasis, the ancient city of Trimithis has emerged little by little from that silence. Its streets, painted rooms, school texts, and church remains allow a gentler kind of history, one built not only from emperors and decrees, but from meals, lessons, prayers, and shade. Deep in Egypt's western desert, the Dakhla Oasis gathers itself in narrow green bands between pale escarpment and open sand, a place where water rising from springs and wells has long made settlement possible. In antiquity, it was one of the great oasis communities, distant from the Nile Valley, and yet never wholly apart from it, since caravan roads stitched the desert to the river and carried people, grain, textiles, news, and official commands across the dry interior. In the western part of Dakhla, near the later settlement of El Qasr, lies Amheida, identified with the ancient city of Trimithis. The site preserves traces from a long span of occupation, though its fullest urban life belongs to the Roman and late Roman centuries, when it served not as a lonely frontier station, but as an important regional center with its own habits of administration, worship, and domestic routine. Above the settlement rose an older sacred core on the Temple Hill, where the remains of the Temple of Thoth were built in the 1st century CE over earlier phases. That layered sanctuary gives the city a long memory. Even under Roman rule, the ground still held the weight of pharaonic religious tradition, and older forms of devotion were not simply erased by imperial time, but folded into it. Trimithis also belonged to a wider desert pattern rather than standing alone. Alongside places such as Mothis and Kelis elsewhere in the oasis, it formed part of a network through which goods, officials, letters, and religious ideas moved with patient regularity. In that sense, the city was provincial, certainly, yet not cut off. Its remoteness was real, though it was the remoteness of a road's far end, not of silence. What archaeology has revealed at Amheida is the texture of an actual town. Streets running between sun-dried brick walls, private houses with their clustered rooms, workshops, a bath complex, painted interiors, and buildings that seem to have served administrative or ceremonial purposes. Mud brick was the material most suited to this landscape, where timber was scarce and where the desert air, so severe to the living, could be unexpectedly kind to abandoned plaster and pigment. In the early 2000s, excavation began here under the Dakhla Oasis project, and later with sponsorship from New York University. Over the seasons that followed, Trimithis emerged slowly, not as a single dramatic ruin lifted cleanly from the sand, but as a lived place assembled fragment by fragment, room by room. That is part of its quiet importance. At Amheida, historians can study urban life in inland Roman and Byzantine Egypt, away from the monumental cities of the Nile, and they can do so in the rare company of both architecture and writing, each still resting beside the other in the desert light. In the 3rd century, and especially the 4th, Trimithis seems to have entered one of its fullest seasons of urban life. Among the clearest signs of that prosperity is an upper-class residence excavators now call the House of Serenos, named for a man who appears in documents as part of the municipal elite, connected to the city council and to the local machinery of status and administration. The house does not speak in the language of imperial magnificence. Its scale is measured, its ambitions domestic. Yet within that measure, there is unmistakable care. Painted walls, ordered suites of rooms, and fine tableware set into the habits of dining and receiving. This was provincial comfort rather than metropolitan luxury, shaped by oasis agriculture, by rents and harvests, by the long caravan routes that carried goods and fashions inward from the Nile Valley and beyond. In a place so far from the sea, refinement had to travel slowly, and once it arrived, it settled into plaster, pottery, and routine. The rooms of Amheida also preserve a quieter truth about desert towns, which is that survival and elegance often depended on reuse. Archaeologists have found extensive recycling of materials across the site, broken pottery repurposed, building fabric adapted, fragments of writing supports used again in household and public settings. This does not read simply as want. It suggests an efficient urbanism, attentive to scarcity, in which useful matter was rarely allowed to remain useless for long. Mud brick could be repaired, walls could be altered, vessels could take on second lives, and the remains of earlier activity could be folded back into the present. In the Oasis, maintenance was not a background task, but one of the main forms of civic intelligence, a patient answer to distance, heat, and limited resources. Beside the house of Serenos lay one of the most intimate discoveries at Amheida, an adjoining school where writing survives on plaster walls. Here, in a classroom made durable by dryness, exercises and literary passages in Greek still linger across the surface, preserving lines derived from Homer, Plutarch, and even a lost tragedy of Euripides. The effect is unusually close. One can almost imagine a teacher dictating, a pupil repeating, the scratch of practice and correction in the afternoon light. The school also reveals the social texture of Byzantine Egypt in the Oasis. Greek literary culture was alive here without erasing older Egyptian traditions, and formal education could flourish far from Alexandria, in a town where language, municipal ambition, and social standing were closely braided together. To learn Greek well in Trimithis was not merely to read admired texts. It was to inhabit a certain kind of civic personhood. Around and beneath later structures, excavators also traced the bath complex, reminding us that Roman bathing in a place like this was never only indulgence. Heated rooms, careful water management, and the architecture of washing point to a civic routine in which bodies, conversation, and public identity were all maintained against the harshness outside. Elsewhere in the town, streets were lined with mixed-use buildings, with domestic rooms opening near workshops and storage spaces, pottery from kitchens and work areas, installations for food preparation, and the modest arrangements of smaller houses all suggest a settlement sustained by repetition, carrying water, shielding interiors from dust, storing grain, repairing walls, and keeping cool where possible through shade and thickness of brick. Prosperity in Dakhla was real, but it was never effortless. It depended on daily acts of care, repeated so often that they became almost invisible, like bathwater drying from stone before evening settled over the oasis. In the 4th century CE, Trimithis became visibly Christian. At Amheida, excavators identified a church known as Building 7, dated to this period, and its presence places the oasis firmly within the wider religious transformation of late antique Egypt. Even here, far west of the Nile Valley, the changes that were reshaping towns, villages, and institutions had taken architectural form in mud brick and plaster. The church was laid out on a basilical plan, orderly and spacious, with an interior once brightened by painted decoration, including a geometric ceiling whose measured patterns must have hovered above worship like a quiet extension of the desert sky. Its use was not only liturgical. Crypts and funerary spaces tied the building to burial and remembrance, making it one of the earliest archaeologically attested Christian church complexes in Egypt's desert interior. In such remains, Christianity does not arrive as an abstraction. It appears as walls aligned for gathering, pigments mixed by hand, and chambers prepared to hold the dead within a consecrated setting. And yet the change feels less like rupture than accumulation. The older sacred landscape did not vanish at once. The Temple of Thoth still belonged to the memory and fabric of the town, while newer Christian institutions took root among houses, streets, workshops, and baths already shaped by Roman civic habits. Byzantine Egypt in the Oasis seems layered in this way, each generation building beside, over, and through what had come before. A church standing in Trimithis suggests not only doctrine, but people, clergy responsible for ritual and teaching, donors able to sponsor construction or decoration, mourners gathering for burial, craftsmen spreading plaster and painting ceilings, and families who expected memory to be held within a Christian community. In a settlement so distant from the great episcopal centers of the Nile, these traces carry a particular intimacy. They suggest a town that was not peripheral to itself, but fully engaged in making a local religious life with the materials and skills at hand. Its ending came more softly than many ruined places invite us to imagine. Trimithis was eventually abandoned, likely over the course of late antiquity, as settlement patterns within the oasis shifted and as environmental or economic pressures altered the terms of local life. The evidence does not point to a single dramatic fall. Instead, there's the slower work of disuse. Mud brick walls softened at the edges, roofs gave way, thresholds filled, and drifting sand entered room by room until streets and courtyards settled into silence. The desert, which made ordinary habitation so demanding, also became an unusually careful keeper. In the dry covering earth, wall texts endured, pigments clung to plaster, and domestic layouts remained legible with a tenderness that wetter climates rarely allow. Because of that preservation, Amheida has become one of the clearest windows into everyday life in late Roman and Byzantine Egypt, not through royal inscriptions or battlefield narratives, but through a counselor's house, a teacher's wall, a bath, and a church standing quietly in the oasis. What remains at Dakhla is not only the outline of a lost city, but the afterimage of ordinary time. A classroom wall, a painted ceiling, a bath, a street turning between mud brick houses. In the stillness of the oasis, Byzantine Egypt becomes briefly domestic again, and very near.